Hey everyone, Derek Elliott from Dirk.com here, and first of all, this is the first video I'm publishing since passing 100,000 subscribers here on YouTube, so thank you very much for that. I'm working on a more proper video to celebrate that, but one of my goals is to start putting more videos out there, so I didn't want that one to hold up this one, which today I'm going to walk you through the relatively simple process for creating this sort of layered topographic look here in Blender. You can use this for making your own little mini maps, mini worlds as a basis for an architectural render, or really whatever you like. We'll cover everything to end up with this result, but of course I want you to take what we cover here today and make it your own. I've had a lot of fun with this technique and I think you will too. So let's get started. Alright, so I'm in a pretty basic Blender 2.93.3 scene with a camera and a lamp that I'm going to press X to delete, and we'll actually hold on to this default cube. We are going to use that to sort of create our boolean object that cuts the layers to create our topographic map effect. So like I mentioned, we're going to use a displacement modifier. So let's go ahead and add that once I find it. There it is. And now if you've ever used a displacement modifier before, you'll know a couple things. First of all, we're going to need a texture. So I'm going to press new, and then by pressing this little button here, it'll jump me over to the texture tab, which is this one down here. By default, it's set to image or movie, but I'm going to use clouds instead. Now, the other thing with the displacement modifier is that it needs geometry to displace. So if we were going to go into edit mode, we'd see that there is just our cube there. So we need to add quite a bit of geometry so we can actually see what's going on. And this would need to be on top of the displacement modifier. But if we add a few levels there, you can see that that's kind of what the displacement modifier is doing. We have some control over the strength. And then of course in the texture tab, you can control the size of that. You can do some kind of a cool effects here with these options. But I don't want it to go all around and out like that. I really just need this to go up and down. So in the modifier settings, I'm going to change this from direction normal to Z, so that we'll just have it going up and down. Now the other thing with this is that I really only need it on one side, not the whole thing, and I don't want it to be rounded because the object we're going to cut into is going to be more of a square plane shape. So instead of using the subdivision surface modifier, I'm going to press X to delete that. I'm going to go into edit mode and then just selecting this bottom face here, I'm going to right click and subdivide it. And then I can press Shift R to repeat that action a few times, just until I have a pretty dense geometry down there on the bottom face. And now you can see, tabbing back out of edit mode, we've got exactly that look we want. And this is going to be kind of the inverse of our mountains that we're going to cut. So what I'll do is go ahead and bring this up on the Z-axis a little bit, and then let's go ahead and add that first layer, and that's going to be a plane. So what I want to do is move this object basically down into that one and have it sort of cut it. So to cut it, I'm going to add a boolean modifier, which is going to be right there, and then select this object. And then when I move it down, it will start to cut into that, which is difficult to see now because the object is in the way. So with that object selected, I can go down here into my viewport display and change that from textured to, you could do bounds, and we'll probably do that eventually, but just for now to make it easier to see, we'll do wire. And you can see that that is what the Boolean operation is doing. It's using this object to cut into that plane object. And now what I want to do next is, of course, have a little bit of thickness to this layer. So the way I'm going to do that is by adding another modifier, which will be a solidify modifier. So we can have that go either direction and then control the thickness with this control right here. And you might get some glitchiness here. One thing you can do is, first of all, scale this plane down just a little bit, and I'm doing this in edit mode so that my scale stays 1 over here. I just like the Boolean object to extend a little beyond, but noticing a little bit of the issue now where it's not doing a perfect cut, and I've realized that in the Boolean options, if you change this from the exact method to the fast method, it tends to work a little bit more like you'd expect. So we've got our first layer there, but of course I want more than just that one. So I'm going to add in an array modifier. Now by default, the array is going to go out on the x-axis by 1 relative unit, which means it's just going to put it pretty much right next to the other one. But I don't want that. I want it to go up, and I'm going to use instead a constant offset. And instead of going that way, I want it to go on the Z-axis, and I'm going to actually make it go exactly the distance of this solidify, so that it goes up just that much. Which, if that's exactly what you wanted, you would you could use the relative offset, but you'll see in a minute why the constant offset works better. So I'm going to type in that same value, 0.01 here, and then that will go up. So you can start to add more layers by doing this, but you'll see we're not getting the effect that we were looking for. See, no matter how many layers we add, it's still just going to go straight up. And that's because, as you know, order of operations matters quite a bit when it comes to these modifiers. So the Boolean is happening first, and then it's being solidified, and then it's being arrayed. So there's no new information going into this that would tell it to, basically, take into consideration that Boolean. So I needed to switch up the order here a little bit. So the first thing I'd want to do is probably slide up the array to be first so that those get arrayed. And yeah, you can see it's working fine there. If the solidify was first, you would just basically, it's just kind of like a chunk in our, object is just being, cut sort of funky. It's just like a solid thing. We don't have those nice straight lines on the edge. So you want it to be in this particular order where you're doing the array, then the Boolean, and then the solidify. So you can see if we hide the solidify, that's the look we're getting. It's kind of cutting all those layers. So turning that back on, you can see we have exactly the look we're going for. And just to make this a little bit easier to see in the viewport, you can change this, you can turn this cavity option on, which will just give us some nice kind of edges here. Now it is all really jagged, which that may be a look you're going for, but I want it to be a little bit more smooth. So I'm going to right click and shade this smooth, which of course will give us one heck of a mess here. And that's because it's trying to smooth the entire thing out. But what I can do is in my normals setting for this mesh, I can turn on auto smooth, and that will control angles greater than 30 degrees and make them sharp. And you could change this up a little bit. You can see some areas here still getting the sharp effect. But if we brought this pretty much all the way up to almost 90, as soon as it goes over 90, because these angles are 90, it's going to try to smooth those. So leave that at a pretty high value, and you should get pretty much what you're looking for. You can see there's still a couple areas where it's a little bit sharp. Now, if you wanted to make this whole thing a little bit smoother, you're going to want to do that in the options for the cutter object. So you could either add a subdivision surface, or better yet, just go into that object and then maybe subdivide that bottom one more time. So right click and subdivide. And that'll make it quite a bit smoother just because it's working with that displacement. It's got more data to work with and it can make it smoother. Now you could of course control the size here to make there be more mountains or less mountains. The depth is going to kind of control the scratchiness of that. I think it looks best if you leave that pretty low, and you could even drop that down to 1 if you want them to be really smooth. And there's other things you could do on the actual displacement object too, like adding a smooth modifier or something like that. But this is looking pretty good. Now the one control we might want to affect here would be the strength of this. So the higher that strength is, it's going to make those cliffs a little bit steeper, and you've kind of got a different appearance there. But I like to leave that pretty low. But again, play with these values as much as you like. So I think the default, or whatever that is, 0.8 looks pretty good. So now you might be thinking, well, what if I want a little more control over that displacement that I'm getting here in the texture options? Well, what you can do is, instead of just using those texture options, we can have the effect of this displacement controlled by an object. So I'm going to add in an empty object, and I'll just make that a sphere, and then drag that kind of just wherever really. And then in the options for this displace modifier, we can change this from local coordinates to object coordinates, and then we can select that empty object. And now what we can do is just move this empty object around, and we can find different parts of the noise pattern that you might like more, depending on the look you're going for. If you want it to look like lakes or something like that, then you could just find kind of a different area you could stretch it out to. And now's a good time to just probably go ahead and turn off this object. So I'm going to name that just so I have better track of it. Let's call that cutter, and then I'll just hide it in the viewport, and then also uncheck this render option so that when you go and render that, it's not going to appear. You can do a lot just now by moving this around. I'm going to press Alt S to reset the scale, and then just kind of find like an interesting area that you think you like. Sometimes as you're moving it, you might get some little glitches, and that's just the Boolean modifier. It's got some kind of weird geometry going on. So if you were actually, and this was another thing I wanted to say, is you could animate this object. If you wanted to make the appearance of it like, like going down like a long river or something, then you could just animate this. The only thing is that sometimes you might get those little glitches and have to re-render a few frames, but this works pretty well to just kind of control the scale, of course, and then, find different areas in your displacement. So I'm just going to move this until I find sort of a cool area. Something like that I think looks pretty nice. And of course, you could go back into the options here and you can make more layers, you can make less layers, you can make them thinner, more detailed. It's all kind of personal preference. There's a lot of things you can do here to get a variety of different looks. If you want these tops to be a little bit more flat, you can drop the layers, or you can add more layers and it'll kind of go as high as the displacement allows it. And then you could, if you wanted to, of course, move the cutter object up or down to make sort of more or less of an ocean sort of there. So something like that I think looks fine for me. Now what I'll do is let's just set up a little bit of a scene here. So the first thing I think I'll do is add in another plane, and I'll just make that kind of the floor. So if you really wanted these caverns and cavities, whatever you want to call them, the valleys to go all the way to the bottom, you could, but I think it looks nice to leave just kind of a little bit of a flat section. So just adding a plane there is going to do that for me, and we can make that a little bit bigger. So let's go ahead and set up our viewport in a way where we can maybe get a little bit of materials going on and then take a look at what this might look like in the rendered view. So I want to add in a camera again, and then I'm going to press Alt-G just to make sure that's centered up, and then press Alt-R so that it's pointing straight down. And then I like to bring this out on the Y-axis, and then RX90 to make sure that's looking straight ahead. And then in the view down here, I'll look in that camera view, and we can also go into our rendered view. So the reason I do that is because what I like to do next is add in another empty object, and I'll use that to control my camera just so that everything stays nice and centered. So I'm going to select that camera, then select this empty object and press Control P to parent it. And now what I can do is just rotate this object as much as I want, and we'll be able to see we'll know that that's nice and centered, and we can rotate this around to get a nice view of our little mountainscape there. So that's a pretty cool little thing. What do I want to do next? I think let's go ahead over here into the rendered view. Now I am in cycles by default, but you might be in Eevee, and you could do this in Eevee or cycles, but some of what we're going to be doing next only works in cycles. So we'll leave that in cycles. And to get some interesting lighting, for one, I'm going to turn on my overlays here. To get some more interesting lighting, I'm going to use, instead of just this default gray world, I'm going to use a sky texture. So clicking there, you can see we have the Nishita Sky enabled, and there's some options in that sky to control the look of this. So this works it's kind of cool the way this works. I'm going to turn this air value all the way up. Kind of looks like there's a fire or something. Shout out to our brethren in California dealing with a lot over there. But we can see with the sun size, that's obviously going to control the size of the sun, and that'll make your shadows more or less sharp. And then you've got options here for air, dust, and ozone. And mainly I just turn the air up so we can see what's happening. But the elevation, of course, is going to bring the sun up, and that will give you sort of some physically accurate colors too as you bring that up. And then the rotation is going to do also exactly what it sounds like. So let's bring this elevation back down. And the rotation is going to spin that sun around. And you can get some very realistic looking skies doing this type of thing. I did a project recently where I used the sky texture, and it gives you pretty realistic looking skies. So going back into my camera view here, I'm going to drop this back down to, I don't remember exactly what the default was. Maybe we'll just put that back at 1. Now I usually like to turn the strength pretty far down. It seems really harsh by default. So turning that down to a 0.2, and then the intensity of the sun, you can also turn down quite a bit. But again, completely up to your own playing around. But let's bring that sky or the elevation to something like a 20 degrees, maybe even like a 15, I think is the default. Looks pretty good. Gives you some nice shadows and things. And then you can spin the sun around to whichever direction you want to get kind of, just an interesting composition going on here. So that's pretty cool. Maybe we bring this up a little bit. The other advantage to doing this is that if I want to move the camera out, I can just control it on this one axis, and then I know it's going to stay perfectly aligned. So let's make this just a little bit bigger. And then I'm going to set a render border with Control B. And if you haven't noticed, my hotkeys are over here in the bottom left. But what can I do now? For one, I can turn on a look in the color management. What do you call that? Yeah, contrast. I like to turn that up to very high. It just looks kind of cool. If you're going to be post-processing this image either in the compositor or in another software like After Effects, you can do that there, but I usually like pretty high contrast, so I just do it right at the render right there. So this is looking pretty cool. You know, if you're going to post this on Instagram, for example, you might want to make that a square, and maybe you don't want quite so much perspective there, so you could, you know, increase your focal length to whatever you want. You could do sort of the orthographic look would be pretty cool here, which then you control with the orthographic scale. Maybe I'll leave that. I think it looks nice, but of course, as always, I encourage you to play around with this as much as you want and just, you know, get it kind of looking however you like. But we've pretty much done the basics here. Beyond the basics, I would say we're doing some lighting, of course, now. But one thing I think is really cool that you can do to really up the level of this is to add sort of like a water layer. So I'm going to press Shift A and add in a plane, and we'll just move that up a little bit. And this will kind of be, yeah, sort of like a water effect by just having that additional layer. Now over here in the materials section, I went up here and I pressed S to open a shader editor. I'm going to hit new, and then let's just name that water, for example. And then, you know, make it whatever color you want, but I think blue water looks pretty good. And then we'll turn up the transmission super high, and then we'll turn the roughness down pretty far so that we can see nicely through that. And you're going to get a decent look here, but it's a little bit hard to see through it. And one of the reasons for that is that you're getting a little bit of a shadow. And for one, I don't want this to extend past the edge. So let's scale this down just a tad, something like that. So there's this kind of glass layer is creating a little bit of a shadow. So in the object settings here, I think in the visibility or maybe shading, visibility, I can change the ray visibility of the shadows to being off, and that's going to help us see through that quite a bit more. And you really start to get this cool effect where you can kind of see that look underneath those layers, and it kind of has this nice undersea appearance. And you could move this, up or down. You can make some, environmental statements with the rising sea levels, or kind of do whatever you want, but it's just kind of a cool effect. And one thing you can also do is turn up the transmission roughness on this a little bit. Gives you a really nice kind of cloudy look where the deeper you get, it's kind of harder to see through that water. You can also do that with just the regular roughness, but I'm not totally sure what the difference is. I guess, there's probably a difference between the transmission roughness and the regular roughness. I haven't done enough research to really tell though. Now, if you wanted this to go all the way through, you could make this like a solid object. Just make sure if you were to do that, that you recalculate your normals. So yeah, this would be like, if you want to see sort of that layer go all the way down. And you could add in like a bump map to make it look like there's some waves or something right there, but I think that looks pretty cool. And from here, you're really pretty much done. You can render this as a still image. If you want to, you can do, where you kind of animate this and have it moving across like you're sort of looking at this, seascape that's just cut away. Now, when you do this, I'm going to try to recreate the issue here. As you move that, sometimes you might run into an issue where there's some glitching and your layers kind of get chopped off a little bit weird. I'm having trouble reproducing it, but if you were to render an animation out like this, you're probably going to have a couple frames where the boolean sort of breaks. And if that happens, all I would recommend doing is just moving it very slightly and then just re-rendering that individual frame and kind of replacing that to fix the issue. And it is always a good idea to render to frames rather than directly to a video. And that's a good example of why. But find yourself a cool little area, do whatever you like. You can get different effects by, going up and down. It's going to make kind of this organic looking thing. And then of course, if you're just panning across, that look, but it's all up to you. It's a lot of fun. This is kind of a really cool effect. I'll just show you maybe a couple other little things. One with the shading, where you can kind of have some control over the way these layers look. So let's go ahead and add a material for this main land. Let's go ahead and call that land. And then I'm going to press Control T with the node wrangler enabled to create these nodes, which if you can't see them, it's an image texture and a mapping node and a texture coordinate. For one, I'm going to change this to generated, and I'm going to switch this to a gradient texture. Control spacebar to get back out of that, and we can see our gradient texture there. So that's doing pretty much what I want. It's going left to right though, and I want it to go kind of top to bottom. So I'm going to rotate this. I think 90 degrees on the y-axis will give me what I'm looking for. So I think the lower layers there are sort of black, but I'm going to add in a converter color ramp drop that right there. And then I can just change this to constant so I can see what I'm doing. But yeah, as we pull this back a little bit, we should start to see those layers. Okay, so yeah, this is a really cool way just to kind of control, the different points here. Maybe down low it's kind of dark and mysterious looking, but yeah, just you can do whatever you want here. Really cool opportunity to play with color and some kind of cool different things there. So let's maybe leave that at we can leave that at like a gray or maybe even like a blue. And then this is kind of a cool way to make it look like you've got some snow caps or something like that. But all up to you. Have fun playing with it. This is a really cool effect. You can see I've done a lot of different kind of little animations and things using this technique. And yeah, it's just a lot of fun. It's a really cool way to, you can use this as the basis for like an architectural model, or you could add some little details. You could add like a little pinpoint here if you wanted to make a like a little Google Maps type pin. Let me show you how I do something like that. Let's add in a circle, mesh circle, and I don't want quite so many things here. Let's just do 16 vertices, and then you could like scale that in, and then maybe bring this down, EY, and then you could kind of like connect this. I'm just trying to make a little pin object here, and then maybe these all get filled in. So you got a face there, spin it up on its edge, scale it all down a little bit. Just an opportunity to sort of tell a little bit of a story. Like, maybe that's you're trying to make it look like that's where the adventurers stopped. This is where they died. Whatever you want. It's all up to you. Let's add a solidify to this. Give it some thickness. Of course, give it a nice red color. Let's just call that pin, and then change it to whatever color you want. Nice red. You kind of tilt this back a little bit so it looks better in your view here. Maybe scale it down a little bit. Yeah, just kind of a, cool little image. Tells a little bit of a story. You could, you could do all sorts of stuff. I think I'll leave it at that. I want to leave it up to your creativity. Definitely tag me on Instagram with whatever you make. Would love to see it. You can animate the sky. There's all sorts of different things. Animating the rotation is kind of a cool effect. Like it's you're at the Arctic Circle and it's going around. Sun's going around the sky. It's up to you. I'll stop blabbering. Have a good time. Hope you enjoyed this tutorial. A lot shorter than my normal ones, but just a really cool effect, and I wanted to share it with you. So thanks for watching. Tag me on Instagram or wherever with what you make, and looking forward to seeing it. Thanks so much for being here.